When looking at Italian battleships, two names generally come to mind. Roma, of course, being the first. Understandably so, with how famous her sinking has become, for how catastrophic it was, and how it pointed the way to the future. However, the other option is almost as famous, that being the far older Giulio Cesare. This is a ship known for her own sinking as much as anything else. A mysterious disaster in Sevastopol after the ship was transferred to the Soviet Union. One that will probably never be solved with any real certainty. As I covered that sinking in my last Sunday video, it only seemed fitting to cover the ship now, because her service, stretching 40 years, has more to it than just blowing up in port. We'll be looking at that story in this video, beginning, of course, in Italy. This is a story that began on June 24th, 1910. A fancy new battleship was laid down in the Anzaldo shipyard in Genoa, the second of the Conte di Cavour class, Italy's first full class of dreadnought battleship, although Cesare was actually laid down first, with her sister ship Leonardo da Vinci coming second on July 18th. Cavour would only be laid down on August 10th, 1910. Regardless, the construction period progressed in typical fashion. Giulio Cesare was launched on October 15th, 1911, a year and a couple months after she was laid down. However, things would dramatically slow down in the fitting out process. This was a common issue with the class as a whole that I covered in my video on Cavour, with the result that Cesare was only completed on May 14th, 1914, a couple months before the Great War broke out, and the first of her class to do so. With all of that said, however, what did the Italians get for their effort? Well, in her original design, Cesare displaced around 23,150 tons at the standard loading. This would have risen to around 25,000 tons at full load. Not the largest ships of their time, but also not the smallest. That displacement allowed Cesare to carry a heavy broadside, 13 305mm 12-inch guns and 5 turrets, 3 triples and 2 twins, carried in a very distinctive layout in this case. 4 of the turrets were in a similar arrangement to the Nevada class, a superfiring pair ahead of the bridge and another superfiring pair on the stern. These saw a twin turret mounted above a triple. Where the Italians broke with tradition was in placing a 5th turret directly amidships. Not the only navy to do so, mind you, but somewhat unique in using a triple turret for the 5th mount. To support the main battery, Cesare carried no fewer than 18 single 120mm 4.7-inch guns. These were carried in the usual casement mountings of the era, which were, in turn, backed up by 14 76mm 3-inch guns. Those varied in their layout, with some mounted on the turret tops and others on the deck. And to round off the weaponry, there were also the usual submerged torpedo tubes, 3 450mm 17.7-inch tubes in this case, one on either broadside and a third in the stern. All of this equipment was protected by a main belt that ranged from 80mm to 250mm in thickness, 3.1 to 9.8 inches for the Americans in the audience. Deck armor, for its part, was 24 to 40mm, or just under an inch to 1.6 inches. This could be pushed through the water at 21.5 knots, by 31,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. And with all the design details out of the way, we can now return to service. After her completion in May 1914, Giulio Cesare had a bit of finishing up to do, with the result she only commissioned on June 7th of 1914, very close to when the Great War broke out. Of course, the Italians were neutral during that conflict's early days, and even after joining the war in 1915, the Italian fleet largely remained in port. Italy had a chronic lack of coal to the point of raiding naval stocks to keep the factories running. Moreover, the Adriatic was not a great place for capital ship warfare, especially in an era where torpedoes were becoming a valid threat. As such, Cesare mostly remained in port for the Great War, with the odd training crews sprinkled in. Even when the war came to an end in 1918, Cesare's story remained a fairly uneventful one. The ship made port visits to the Levant, Palestine, and Syria in 1919 and 1920, and then supported Italian operations on Corfu in 1923, which consisted of bombarding a small detachment of Greek soldiers. Nothing particularly noteworthy there, and the same held true for the rest of the 1920s. In 1926, 3 years after Corfu, Cesare was in reserve, and in 1928, she was shifted to be a gunnery training ship, which, from all indications, remained her role through to the major rebuild in the mid-1930s. For the short version on that topic, France, the naval rival Italy was building against, laid down a new battleship in 1932. That would become Dunkirk. This prompted the Italians to look at their own battle fleet and find it wanting. Their dreadnoughts were aging and had never been properly modernized. They could have built new ships entirely. However, the Italians instead chose to modernize the older pair of dreadnoughts, Cavour and Cesare, Da Vinci having sunk in a magazine explosion during the Great War, which in this case turned out to be less modernized and more full-on rebuild. The Italians would strip the ship down to the bones before rebuilding her from there. The amidships turret was torn out and replaced by a newer and more powerful propulsion system. This new power plant came out to 75,000 shaft horsepower, although on trials it could be pushed as high as 90,000. As well as this, the new boilers were oil-fired instead of coal-fired. This was matched by a new shaft arrangement, in this case a reduction from 4 shafts to 2. In addition to further increased speed, an entirely new bow was grafted on top of the old one. While this did change the lines of the ship, it didn't do much to change the length. Cesare was 176 meters, or 577 feet long, in her original design. The new design, bow and stern changes included, came out to 186 meters, or 611 feet. Not a major change in the grand scheme of things. Another visual change, however, came with the superstructure. This was completely changed up, with new funnels and a new bridge tower. This, along with turreted secondaries, made the ship look far more modern, from an old-school dreadnought to something almost like a very big Italian heavy cruiser. All of this work allowed Cesare to reach around 27 knots in service. A 6-knot improvement in speed is a substantial one, even if this was still on the slower end for a modern fast battleship. The other major change came to the weaponry. As mentioned, the amidships turret was removed. The remaining 4 stayed in place, but the guns were bored out to 320 millimeters, or 12.6 inches. This had some less than desirable impact on their accuracy. However, this is often overplayed as well, a topic for a future video. As for the secondary battery, this became 6 twin 120mm gun mounts. A total of 12 barrels in all carried amidships. These were matched by 4 twin 100mm anti-aircraft mountings for a total of 8 barrels, and a further 6 twin 37mm mounts as well, another dozen guns there, and then a total of 6 twin 13.2mm machine guns for a total of 12 more. Quite the eclectic mix, really. At least the torpedo tubes were removed. In any event, this brings us to the final change, that being the armor protection. No changes were made to the main belt, other than the extra weight submerging it deeper than it should have been. The deck armor, on the other hand, was increased to a maximum of 166 millimeters, or around 6.5 inches in thickness. The biggest change to protection came with the torpedo defense system. A variant on the Puglisi system was fitted. In simplest terms, a large cylinder surrounded by water or oil, designed to absorb a blast by crumpling in and protecting the actual hull. The effectiveness of this system is debated up and down the internet and scholarly material. Regardless, the rebuild ran from 1933 to June 1937, a massive amount of work to say the least, and work that ended up with a completely modernized ship, one that now displaced around 29,000 tons at the full loading. The rest of the 1930s, meanwhile, would be less exciting. After returning to service, the two Cavours mostly spent their time on training, various exercises to test the modified main battery, or the secondary battery, and, of course, to work out any issues with the power plant, which apparently included problems with leaks in the prop shafts as well as the joint between the old and new bow. Beyond these training exercises, there were also port visits, such as one to Malta in June of 1938, and fleet reviews as well, for both visiting Germans and Mussolini at various points, the German review being in May of 1938. This was fairly typical for peacetime duty, no matter which navy. The only real action the ship saw, and I'm stretching that term quite a bit, was supporting the invasion of Albania. That came in May 1939. And, as I said in my Zara class videos, Albania had no navy to speak of. No, the actual proper action came in 1940. While the Second World War broke out in 1939, the Italians waited a bit before entering. Unlike the Great War, this would see the Regia Marina in the thick of it. Italy declared war on the Allies on June 10, 1940. Not even a month later, Cesare would take part in her most notable battle, that being the Battle of Calabria on July 9, 1940. This would set the pattern for most engagements between the Royal Navy and Regia Marina, a long-distance engagement that was largely inconclusive, where neither navy performed particularly poorly, but at the same time, neither would do major damage. Outside of the rather obvious exception of Matapan, this was how most fleet engagements progressed. As for Calabria itself, Cesare was at the center of the action. This battle resulted from the British, under Admiral Cunningham, trying to block the Italians from port. The Italians, for their part, were covering a convoy to Libya. The result would be the two fleets trading fire at extreme range on July 9th, aside from the cruisers which got closer, but were still at long range. The Italians would fail to do much damage to the British, although their fire was reported as very accurate, including straddling HMS Warspite. Some of those straddles also caused splinter damage to nearby destroyers. The British, for their part, proved more accurate, or more lucky. A single shell from Warspite fell down on Cesare. This punched through the aft funnel, which triggered the fuse. The resulting explosion was bad, but probably not as bad as a direct deck penetration. The 15-inch shell blew a hole in the deck and set off severe fires. Smoke from those fires got drawn into the engine rooms, forcing boilers 4 through 7 offline. The crew had to leave or risk suffocating in the smoke. Even so, up to 66 men died, with 44 wounded, or a lower number of 48 deaths and 68 wounded. This would slow Cesare down severely to a maximum speed of around 18 knots. The Italians, unsure of how bad the damage actually was, retreated at this point, not wanting to risk a fight against 3 British battleships, Warspite, Malaya, Royal Sovereign, with a damaged Cesare and admittedly intact Cavour. As it turned out, the damage was relatively minor. Rough to look at, as you can see here, but not terrible. Cesare would be repaired and back in service by the end of August, in time to join her sister in failed attempts at Malta convoys in August and September of 1940. The next time Cesare saw combat, as it turned out, would be the raid on Taranto. This came on the night of November 11th, 1940, which actually turned out okay for Cesare. She avoided any damage at all. The same could not be said for her sister ship, which was taken out of the war by this attack. However, this didn't mean Cesare would have an eventful war. Her next action came at the end of November with the Battle of Cape Spartivento, which was also inconclusive for the most part. Cesare wasn't even able to use her guns during this action. Not a surprising result, but an unfortunate one for the crew, although at least the ship evaded torpedoes from swordfish. 1941 would prove to be even quieter in the grand scheme of things. Cesare was bombed on January 8, 1941, in Naples. This caused minor damage, largely consisting of splinters, as well as some damage from a near miss that the torpedo defense system absorbed as intended. This damage was repaired by early February. It's rather telling that the only other event of real note, at least in 1941, was the First Battle of Sirte on December 17th. There had been attempts to engage British forces earlier in the year, but those came to nothing. The most notable of those being what the Italians thought was a convoy, but was actually a bombardment of Genoa on February 8th. As for Sirte, that was another of the pattern of largely inconclusive fleet actions, much like Calabria, originating out of convoy escort. Unlike Calabria, both fleets were leery of a direct engagement, resulting in a short exchange of fire and not much else. That would, as it turned out, be the last time Cesare faced any enemy force. After this, she participated in some convoy escorts into early 1942. But by March of 1942, the modernized battleships were largely on reserve. Italy lacked the fuel to run them, focusing on conserving that for smaller forces. And the Littorios. The Andrea Doria sisters at least got to train. Cesare was put into reserve, first at Taranto and then at Pola, where she would remain into late 1943, until the Italian Armistice, in fact, in September of 1943. This saw Cesare depart Pola on September 8th, sailing for internment. While less eventful than the Littorio's voyage, which saw Italia damaged and Roma sunk, this wasn't without incident, specifically a mutiny by crewmen who wanted to scuttle the old battleship, instead of handing her over to the British. This was ultimately handled without bloodshed, and Cesare would reach Taranto before sailing on to Malta. The battleship arrived there on September 12, 1943, and was promptly taken out of service. Giulio Cesare remained in Malta until June 17, 1944, at which point she sailed for Taranto and remained there for the rest of her time in Italian service. This does mean that the ship was, for all intents and purposes, out of combat service from early 1942 until her ultimate end. Calabria was her moment to shine, for better or worse. In any event, Cesare, suffering from lack of proper maintenance, languished in Italy, until in 1947 it was confirmed that the ship was going to be transferred to the Soviet Union as a promised war prize, along with assorted smaller ships. The battleship was, by this point, a bit of a mess, and the Italians only did the absolute minimum to make her fit to sail out of protests for the transfer. There were even attempts at sabotage that were stamped down on. The ship was transferred to the Soviet Union on February 6, 1949, in Albania. I have covered her service in the Red Navy in 2 different videos at this point, so I'll give the short version here, and link both the War Prize video and the video on her ultimate fate. Now for the Cliff Notes version. Cesare, after her long inactivation, was a mess. After transfer to the Soviets under the name of Novorossiysk, the ship would be in and out of refit. No fewer than 8 different refits listed on screen now, courtesy of spoils of war. One of those, in 1953, involved tearing out the entire propulsion system. For the second time, counting her initial rebuild, in this case to replace it with Soviet equipment. These were primarily aimed at keeping the ship in service, which in this case was training duty on the Black Sea, to train up crews for Stalin's grand battleship plans. Of course, those plans came to nothing, so Novorossiysk remained a bit of a white elephant, an obsolete ship that was the most powerful in the Black Sea fleet, but used entirely for training and showing the flag, until after a final refit, the ship would suffer a massive detonation in port. That was on the night of October 29th, 1955. The ex-Cesare rolled over, with the loss of 608 to 609 sailors. While conspiracy theories abound, the most likely answer is an old German mine. Either way, the ship was raised from the bottom and ultimately scrapped in 1957. A sad end for a proud ship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.